The desert should have been silent, empty, dead. But beneath its scorched skin, stones still whisper, older than the pyramids, older than pharaohs, older than every story we've ever told of civilization's birth. In the heart of the Sahara, where only wind and sand remain, stands a circle of megaliths carved into alignment with the heavens. Not chance, not accident, precision, solstice, Orion, Sirius, a calendar of stone erected 6,000 years before Christ, while Egypt was nothing but a dream unborn. They called it Nabta Playa. A lake once shimmered here, feeding herders who buried cattle as if they were gods, sealing their bones in ritual tombs while the stars wheeled above. This was no wandering band of tribes. This was calculation, architecture, power. They dragged stones into place with intent so exact it makes the hairs on the neck rise. Who taught them? How did they know the sky's language long before the Nile carried kings to their tombs? The desert swallowed their world. The lake dried, the herders vanished, the stones remained, mute sentinels staring at a cosmos they had mapped before history began. And yet the question burns hotter than the sun. What civilization did we lose to the sands? 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a wasteland of blistering sand and desolation. It was alive. Between 10,000 and 6,000 BCE, during what scholars call the African humid period, the desert was transformed by climate shifts that brought seasonal rains and vast lakes to a land that today feels uninhabitable. What is now an unforgiving expanse of dunes was once a mosaic of grasslands, scattered acacia groves, and shallow freshwater basins. Herds of gazelle, giraffe, and wild cattle grazed on its plains. People followed them, hunting, herding, gathering, and later shaping a society that would leave behind traces so enigmatic that modern archaeologists are still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of their achievement. The evidence is not speculation. Core samples taken from ancient lake beds, fossilized pollen, and sediments show that rainfall during this period expanded northward, pushing the monsoon belt into the Sahara. Around 9,000 BCE, vast stretches of what is now barren land were dotted with lakes and rivers. Nabta Playa, a shallow basin located roughly 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel in southern Egypt, filled seasonally with water. Here, life clustered around its edges. For months at a time, pastoral communities gathered to water their animals, perform rituals, and shape their identity as more than mere survivors in a hostile land. Archaeologists have traced their existence through shards of pottery, hearths blackened by cooking fires, and the bones of cattle carefully buried in stone-lined pits. Radiocarbon dating places their activity between 8800 and 4000 BCE, a span of nearly 5,000 years. These were not wandering nomads stumbling from one oasis to the next. Their presence was deliberate, their organization evident in the structures they raised. They were herders, early domesticators of cattle, men and women who read the land and sky with a precision so advanced it forces modern scholarship to reassess how early human intelligence shaped civilization. The modern Sahara gives no clue to this past. When travelers look out across its horizons, they see a landscape stripped bare, a silence that seems eternal. Yet beneath that silence lies a buried archive of human history. Stone rings, alignments, and tumuli lie scattered beneath the sand, monuments that predate the Egyptian pyramids by more than a millennium. They remain in place like the bones of a forgotten giant, proof that long before kings rose on the Nile, there were people in the desert who could raise megaliths and align them with the turning of the heavens. The contrast between then and now is staggering. Around 6000 BCE, the climate began to shift again. The rains faltered, the monsoon line retreated southward, and the Sahara began its transformation into the desert we know today. By 4000 BCE, Nabta Playa was abandoned, its lake gone, its fertile ground turned to dust. The people dispersed, some moving eastward into the Nile Valley, carrying with them traditions, astronomical knowledge, and ritual practices that may have influenced the earliest foundations of Egyptian civilization. The land that once sustained them erased nearly all trace of their existence, hiding a chapter of humanity so profound that its rediscovery in the 20th century struck like a revelation. When archaeologists first stumbled across Nabta Playa in the 1970s, they found a desolate basin littered with stones. It was easy to overlook, another patch of desert indistinguishable from the millions of square kilometers around it. But careful excavation revealed a story concealed under layers of sand. At its heart stood a stone circle, constructed around 4800 to 4500 BCE. Its slabs were not placed haphazardly. They were oriented to track the rising of the summer solstice sun and the movement of Orion's belt, aligning the cycles of heaven with the rhythms of the earth. Such precision cannot be dismissed as coincidence. It reflects intentional observation, calculations spanning generations, and a worldview in which survival was inseparable from celestial order. What makes this more arresting is its antiquity. Stonehenge in Britain would not rise until nearly 2,000 years later. The pyramids of Giza would not dominate the Nile until around 2500 BCE. Yet here, on the margins of a seasonal lake in the middle of the Sahara, people who left no written records and no dynastic kings arranged their lives around the cosmos. They built in stone not for shelter, but for meaning. This is not the romanticized vision of desert wanderers. The archaeological record grounds it in reality. Pottery fragments from Nabta Playa, decorated with distinctive ripple patterns, represent some of the earliest ceramics in Africa, dating as far back as 8,800 BCE. Hearths, dated to 6,100 BCE, show organized campsites. Cattle bones buried in stone chambers around 5,400 BCE reveal ritual practices. Animals interred not for food, but as offerings, symbols of wealth and reverence. These communities understood the value of permanence, even in a land where survival depended on movement. They anchored their beliefs in monuments that would outlast them. The African humid period was not eternal. Its beginning around 10,000 BCE had been abrupt, triggered by shifts in Earth's orbit and the expansion of monsoonal rains. Its end was equally sudden, driven by the same celestial mechanics that once granted abundance. As aridity returned, lakes vanished, forcing those who had thrived along their shores to abandon their stone circles and cattle burials. Their world contracted, their rituals displaced. Yet the stones endured, silent markers of an age when the desert was green and its people reached toward the sky for order and survival. The question remains like an open wound in history. Why here? Why then? What compelled pastoral herders to mark the heavens with such precision at Nabta Playa, centuries before the Nile saw its first temples? What vision of life and death demanded cattle be buried with reverence, in a land where every drop of water meant survival? These questions are not answered in texts or chronicles, for none survive from this time. They are written only in the soil, in the orientation of stones, in the remains of fires that once warmed those who gathered at the lake's edge. The Sahara conceals more than it reveals. Beneath its endless dunes lie echoes of societies erased by climate, memory, and time. Nabta Playa is only one basin among hundreds, yet it carries within it a magnitude of meaning. A prehistoric society that commanded both earth and sky, then vanished as the rains withdrew. It challenges the sequence of history, placing sophistication not in the hands of pharaohs or Mesopotamian kings, but in cattle herders who raised their eyes to the stars while the rest of humanity still clung to survival. And there, beneath the silence of sand and wind, the stones remain. In the early 1970s, when most of the world's archaeological focus in Egypt was still fixed on the Nile Valley and its monumental pharaonic legacy, an American archaeologist named Fred Wendorf turned his attention away from the river. He and his colleagues began surveying the vast emptiness of the Western Desert, searching not for temples or tombs but for the faintest traces of prehistoric settlement. Wendorf, a professor at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, was no stranger to the Sahara. He had already worked on Paleolithic sites in North Africa and believed the desert held chapters of human history long erased from collective memory. What he and his team encountered over the next 2 decades would shift the understanding of civilization's origins and expose one of the oldest ceremonial sites on Earth, Nabta Playa. Nabta Playa lay inconspicuously in Egypt's southern desert, about 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel. To an untrained eye, it appeared as nothing more than a flat basin scattered with stones. But to archaeologists accustomed to reading landscapes, the arrangement was suspicious. Natural erosion does not produce patterns. Human hands leave order in the chaos of rock. Beginning in 1973, Wendorf's team surveyed the basin and returned repeatedly over the years, conducting systematic excavations throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s. Each season revealed more than the last. Beneath layers of sand and hardened sediment, they unearthed hearths, pottery fragments, stone structures, and most strikingly, a circle of upright slabs that had been intentionally placed. The initial challenge was dating. Without inscriptions, without written testimony, the only way to measure time was through radiocarbon analysis. Charcoal remnants from ancient hearths, bones from sacrificed cattle, and organic residue embedded in pottery provided the samples. Using radiocarbon dating, calibrated against known atmospheric variations, the results were astonishing. The site's main activity clustered between 8800 BCE and 4000 BCE, with the megalithic structures appearing around 4800 to 4500 BCE. These figures placed Nabta Playa well before Egypt's dynastic period, centuries before Mesopotamia's first cities, and nearly 2,000 years earlier than Britain's Stonehenge. The desert that now appeared lifeless had once supported a culture capable of constructing one of the earliest known astronomical monuments in human history. The stone circle was the centerpiece. Roughly 4 meters in diameter, its slabs stood upright, some reaching nearly 2 meters in height. They were not random placements. Measurements showed that certain stones aligned precisely with the rising sun at the summer solstice, while others corresponded to the belt of Orion and the heliacal rising of Sirius. This level of accuracy required sustained observation of the sky, passed down across generations, and an understanding of celestial cycles that could not have arisen by chance. To build in stone what they read in the heavens meant that these people had already begun to synchronize human existence with the cosmos. But Nabta Playa was more than an observatory. Excavations revealed tumuli, low, circular mounds of stone that covered cattle burials. One in particular contained the skeleton of a calf carefully interred in a stone chamber, dating to around 5400 BCE. This was not a casual disposal of remains. It was deliberate, ceremonial, and imbued with meaning. The cattle cult, later so prominent in Egyptian religion, had one of its earliest expressions here. To bury animals with such reverence in a land where survival was precarious demonstrates how strongly these pastoralists invested spiritual significance into their herds. Archaeologists also uncovered alignments of megaliths extending outward from the playa, forming avenues and patterns that may have marked processional routes or sacred boundaries. Some of these alignments stretched for hundreds of meters, requiring coordinated labor and a vision larger than individual survival. It suggested the existence of social organization, the ability to plan, and perhaps even the emergence of ritual leadership. This was not the work of isolated families, but of communities who returned season after season, generation after generation, reinforcing their connection to the landscape with stone and ceremony. The shock among scholars was immediate. The prevailing model of the 20th century had placed the origins of complex society firmly in the river valleys of the Nile and Mesopotamia, where agriculture supported permanent settlements and the rise of kingship. Yet here, in the barren western desert, people had raised monumental architecture long before the Nile's great temples were imagined. Nabta Playa forced a rethinking of prehistory, suggesting that complexity, measured in astronomy, ritual, and organized construction, could arise outside the fertile floodplains, in places where mobility and survival seemed paramount. The evidence was painstakingly documented. Wendorf's team mapped every slab, measured every alignment, and cataloged every artifact. Pottery fragments decorated with distinctive ripple designs were among the oldest in Africa, dating as far back as 8800 BCE. Hearths scattered across the playa indicated repeated occupations, some clustered around wells that once drew groundwater to the surface. Flint tools testified to hunting and butchering, while grinding stones pointed to the processing of wild plants. Yet it was the monumental stones, immovable and unyielding, that carried the greatest weight. They demonstrated intent. They signaled belief. They revealed a capacity for abstraction, for turning observation of the sky into enduring structure. By the 1990s, the cumulative evidence was undeniable. Nabta Playa was not an isolated curiosity, but a major ceremonial center in the heart of what is now the Sahara. It was a place where herders gathered, where rituals were enacted, where the passage of the seasons was tracked in stone. The dating placed its construction firmly in the late Neolithic, thousands of years before Egyptian dynasties and long before written records could explain its purpose. Its existence suggested that knowledge, belief, and social complexity were not confined to the river valleys, but had been nurtured in the shifting ecologies of the desert. To stand at Nabta Playa, even as an archaeologist cataloging fragments and measuring alignments, was to confront the weight of lost time. The sand had hidden it for millennia, erasing the lives that once animated its stones, but not the stones themselves. What lay exposed in the desert was a record written not in ink or hieroglyphs but in rock and bone. A statement from people who lived 8,000 years ago that they understood their world in ways more advanced than history had granted them credit for. Nabta Playa was older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, and yet it stood as solid proof that long before pharaohs ruled the Nile, the desert had already known architects, astronomers, and ritualists who left their mark in stone, waiting to be found. At Nabta Playa, life was dictated by cycles that could not be ignored. The rains that swelled the basin each summer turned an empty depression into a lake, pulling pastoralists from across the desert to its shores. Between 8800 and 4000 BCE, groups of herders converged here seasonally, tethering survival to the rhythm of the monsoon. They were not sedentary farmers, nor aimless wanderers. Their movements were calculated, their returns predictable, anchored by water, cattle, and ritual. Each gathering at the playa was both practical and ceremonial, ensuring that daily existence and sacred order remained bound together. Cattle defined their world. The earliest evidence suggests that by around 8800 BCE, wild bovids roamed the region, but by 700 to 6500 BCE, herding had taken hold. The bones uncovered at Nabta Playa show cattle that were likely managed, if not fully domesticated. These were not hunted animals but living wealth, mobile stores of food, status, and spiritual significance. Archaeologists unearthed stone-lined pits where cattle had been deliberately buried, some intact, others disarticulated but placed with precision. One burial, dating to around 5400 BCE, contained a calf laid within a stone chamber, its death sanctified rather than wasted. In the harsh desert margins, where every resource mattered, such a sacrifice was unthinkable unless imbued with ritual meaning. These burials mark one of the earliest known expressions of the cattle cult that would echo later in ancient Egypt, where bulls symbolized kingship, fertility, and divine power. Survival, however, was not achieved through ritual alone. The playa reveals practical ingenuity that matched spiritual intensity. Archaeologists identified evidence of wells dug into the basin, some reaching up to 12 meters deep. These wells allowed groups to remain longer than seasonal rains would otherwise permit, tapping into groundwater reserves when surface water evaporated. Around them, hearths accumulated, marked by clusters of ash, charcoal, and stone tools. Radiocarbon dating of these hearths shows repeated use over centuries, proof that the playa was not an occasional stop but a recurring hub of life. The hearths themselves tell of cooking, of communal meals, of families gathering at the edge of a desert lake that no longer exists. Pottery fragments, scattered across the playa, offer another window into daily existence. The ripple-burnished wares, some dating back to 8800 BCE, are among the earliest ceramics found in Africa. Their decoration was not elaborate, but the technique required skill, suggesting that even utilitarian vessels carried meaning. The presence of large storage jars indicates an ability to preserve liquids or grains, a hint that pastoralists balanced herding with foraging or early cultivation. Pottery, fragile as it is, becomes a testament to permanence. Objects made to last through repeated gatherings, shared meals, and ritual acts. Social life at Nabta Playa was structured around mobility but anchored by community. The evidence of cattle burials and monumental stone alignments indicates cooperation on a scale larger than any single family group. To haul megaliths, arrange them in circles, and align them with astronomical precision required planning, consensus, and leadership. These were not sedentary states with kings and armies, but the seeds of organized society are visible in the stones they left. Seasonal gatherings likely reinforced bonds between dispersed groups. At the lake's edge, trade of goods, exchange of spouses, and renewal of social alliances would have occurred, ensuring survival in a landscape that demanded cooperation. The playa was a meeting point, a stage where ritual, astronomy, and daily life intersected. Astronomical alignments carved into the stone circle were not detached from everyday existence. The observation of the stars was tied directly to survival. Knowing when the summer solstice occurred meant predicting the rains. The return of Sirius to the pre-dawn sky heralded the onset of the wet season. Aligning slabs to these celestial markers was not abstract science, but a calendar that governed herding cycles, migration patterns, and ritual gatherings. The stones carried knowledge across generations, a fixed reminder in a shifting desert. Every excavation layer revealed the duality of existence at Nabta Playa, the pragmatic and the sacred woven inseparably together. Grinding stones uncovered at the site suggest processing of wild grasses or perhaps cultivated cereals, balancing pastoralism with plant-based sustenance. Flint tools point to hunting that supplemented herding. Yet beside these functional artifacts stand cattle burials that speak not of consumption but reverence, and megaliths that testify to a cosmology larger than survival alone. In this place, the act of living was elevated into an act of meaning. The scale of organization required for such acts cannot be overstated. Archaeologists estimate that some of the megaliths weighed several tons. Moving them demanded not only physical strength but also coordination, planning, and shared belief strong enough to compel labor beyond immediate necessity. That such efforts were expended by pastoralists, often stereotyped as mobile and transient, challenges assumptions about what mobility meant. Nabta Playa's people were not rootless. They rooted themselves in cycles of return, anchoring their identity in a landscape they knew would eventually betray them as the climate shifted. As the African humid period waned after 600 BCE, mobility became ever more critical. The shrinking of lakes, the unpredictability of rains, and the creeping advance of desert forced adaptation. Yet, instead of dispersing without trace, these groups carved permanence into impermanence. They dug wells deeper, extended rituals further, raised stones higher. Each gathering at Nabta Playa became both a reaffirmation of life and a defense against its fragility. By returning season after season, they left behind a palimpsest of occupation that archaeologists thousands of years later could reconstruct layer by layer. Even the smallest details carry weight. The arrangement of hearths shows clustering, evidence of families or kin groups setting camps together. The repeated repair of pottery fragments suggests care and conservation. The stratigraphy of ash layers testifies to centuries of occupation in the same spaces, each fire built upon the remnants of the last. These traces are more than archaeological data. They are the direct imprint of lives lived in patterns as regular as the stars above them. Nabta Playa's pastoralists lived in constant negotiation with the land. Their cattle needed water, their families needed food, their rituals needed permanence. Every solution, digging wells, making pottery, aligning stones, was both practical and symbolic. Their survival was not accidental but engineered, shaped by knowledge transmitted across generations. And when they gathered at the playa, they carried not only their herds but their memory, their cosmology, their willingness to shape stone and time into a structure that outlived them. The traces left behind do not fade into silence. They sharpen into evidence of a society that lived by movement yet built monuments to stability, herded cattle yet buried them as sacred beings, watched the stars not for curiosity but for survival, and returned to the same playa for thousands of years, carving their existence into a desert that would one day erase them from sight but not from history. Around 4800 to 4500 BCE, in the heart of what is now one of the driest deserts on Earth, people raised stones that refused to yield to time. At Nabta Playa, the megalithic circle and its alignments did not rise by chance. Each slab, hauled across the basin and set upright in the earth, bore a purpose more exact than survival. These stones were instruments, their positions tethered not to arbitrary design but to the order of the heavens. Long before pharaohs carved solar temples along the Nile, pastoralists on a seasonal lake in the Sahara aligned rock with sky, binding their lives to cycles that could not be broken. The circle itself measured only a few meters across, but its meaning far exceeded its size. Within it, smaller slabs oriented toward specific points on the horizon. Studies conducted after its excavation in the 1970s and 1980s revealed the alignments were not accidental. One set pointed to the rising sun at the summer solstice, the exact moment when the rains returned to refill the playa. Another configuration traced the belt of Orion, a constellation that later became central to Egyptian religious cosmology. Still another alignment marked the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, whose reappearance in dawn's light would, millennia later, announce the annual flooding of the Nile. At Nabta Playa, centuries before dynastic Egypt, these same celestial events were already being tracked with stone. Such precision required long observation. To identify the solstice is not the work of a single year. It demands watching the sun's path across the horizon for seasons upon seasons, recording its extremes, and recognizing the moment when it turns. The orientation toward Orion and Sirius points to an even deeper investment in the sky, for their cycles unfold not over days or months but across years. To carve these rhythms into rock was to translate time itself into permanence, a message left for generations who would return to the same circle to reassert their connection to the cosmos. This act of sky-watching at Nabta Playa cannot be separated from survival. The solstice was not a distant abstraction. It determined the onset of rainfall, the moment when the barren playa became a lake, when cattle could be watered and herders could sustain themselves. The stars were not symbols but signals, their rising and setting tied directly to life and death. By aligning their stones with celestial events, the pastoralists of Nabta Playa created the first known calendar in Africa, one written not on clay or papyrus, but into the landscape itself. What makes the site staggering is its antiquity. Stonehenge, the great monument of Britain, dates to roughly 3000 to 2000 BCE, nearly 2,000 years younger than Nabta Playa's circle. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, monumental stairways to the heavens, rose around 2100 BCE. In the Americas, Mesoamerican observatories, such as those at Monte Alban or Chichen Itza, appeared even later. Yet here, in the 5th millennium BCE, pastoralists in a Sahara that still held lakes were already turning astronomy into architecture. The same impulse that drove later civilizations to align temples, pyramids, and observatories had its precedent in the desert stones. Nabta Playa belongs to this lineage, a beginning point in humanity's attempt to synchronize society with the cosmos. The alignment with Orion carries particular weight. In later Egyptian cosmology, the constellation became associated with Osiris, lord of the dead and guarantor of rebirth. The pyramids of Giza, constructed around 2500 BCE, were laid out to reflect the belt of Orion, their shafts aligned with its stars. That such an association appears already in the stone arrangements of Nabta Playa suggests continuity of thought across millennia. The connection between cattle cults at the playa and the later Apis bull of Egypt, combined with Orion's persistent symbolic presence, points to a heritage of ideas carried from desert pastoralists into the Nile Valley. The inclusion of Sirius further sharpens this connection. In Egypt, the heliacal rising of Sirius, known as Sopdet, marked the beginning of the calendar year and the flood of the Nile, the event on which all agricultural life depended. At Nabta Playa, long before agriculture along the Nile reached its full development, Sirius was already being tracked with precision. Its reappearance at dawn would have been tied not to the Nile but to the life-giving rains that replenished the playa. The alignment is evidence that people here had already mapped a relationship between stellar cycles and terrestrial renewal, a framework later inherited and transformed by pharaonic culture. The stones also reveal something about social order. Aligning megaliths with astronomical events required planning, knowledge holders, and leaders capable of directing collective labor. These were not scattered foragers but communities with a capacity for coordinated construction. The effort required to haul and erect slabs weighing up to several tons suggests shared belief strong enough to compel action beyond subsistence. This is not monumentalism for spectacle but for survival and meaning, the embedding of cosmic order into earthbound structure. When archaeologists compared Nabta Playa to Stonehenge, the similarities were striking, though the sites were worlds apart. Both aligned with solstices, both functioned as calendars, both were centers of gathering and ritual. Yet Nabta Playa predated Stonehenge by centuries, constructed not by farmers in a temperate landscape, but by pastoralists on the edge of a drying desert, where Mesopotamian ziggurats raised platforms to bridge heaven and earth. Nabta Playa aligned slabs of stone to anchor heaven to earth's horizon. Where Mesoamerican societies later built temples to mirror celestial movements, the herders of the Sahara achieved the same in miniature, their circle small in size but vast in significance. The cosmology implied by Nabta Playa is neither incidental nor trivial. By marking solstices and stellar risings, the community articulated a worldview in which human time was subordinate to cosmic time. The rains that filled their lake were not random. They were heralded by the sun's position and the stars' appearance. Ritual gatherings at the playa, reinforced by cattle sacrifice and communal feasting, synchronized society not only with seasonal survival but with celestial cycles. In such a world, stone and star became inseparable, and the playa was transformed into a sacred calendar etched into the desert floor. Every alignment carved into Nabta Playa speaks of a people who refused to let the chaos of nature dictate their existence. They imposed order, found patterns, and inscribed them in stone. Their circle, humble in size compared to the colossal monuments of later civilizations, stands as one of humanity's earliest attempts to anchor meaning in the eternal movements of the sky. Long before the pyramids mirrored Orion, long before temples aligned with Sirius, the pastoralists of Nabta Playa had already raised stones that watched the heavens and bound human survival to the cycles of stars and solstice. At Nabta Playa, stones were not the only monuments raised to the heavens. Beneath the sands, archaeologists uncovered signs that the desert basin was more than a calendar. It was a sacred landscape, a place where life and death, survival and worship, were bound together in ritual. Between 600 and 5500 BCE, long before the first Egyptian kings, people gathered here to bury cattle in carefully dug tumuli. Not the remains of feasts or the refuse of slaughter, but entire animals interred whole, often within stone-lined chambers. These were no casual acts of disposal. They were sacrifices, offerings of what was most precious to a pastoral society, sealed in earth as if to anchor the sacred power of life itself. The cattle burials define Nabta Playa as something greater than a campsite or seasonal refuge. For herders whose lives revolved around their animals, to kill and bury them was to give up sustenance, wealth, and survival. Archaeological excavation revealed one burial where a cow was placed in its entirety inside a clay-lined pit, its remains preserved by careful construction. Other tumuli held cattle bones arranged with precision, not scattered or discarded. This was deliberate ritual, repeated across generations, signaling a belief that the act of burial forged a connection between human communities, their herds, and the unseen forces that governed rainfall and renewal. By 5000 BCE, as the climate shifted and the Sahara began to dry, the stakes of ritual grew even sharper. The lake at Nabta Playa, fed by summer monsoons, was not eternal. Each year's floodwaters could mean survival or collapse. The cattle sacrifices, repeated in cycles, were likely tied to this precarious rhythm. To bury an animal was to invoke continuity, a plea for the rains to return, for the playa to refill, for grass to grow once more. The tumuli scattered across the basin thus became anchors of collective faith, stone and earth binding society to cosmic order through ritual repetition. The placement of these burials reveals more than devotion, it reveals organization. Constructing tumuli, lining pits with stone, and coordinating communal ceremonies required leadership and shared obligation. Not every member of society could give up a cow. The decision must have been sanctioned, the ritual overseen. In this, Nabta Playa provides evidence of hierarchy emerging in pastoral societies of the Sahara. The authority to command sacrifice and to designate sacred ground reflects the rise of figures who held both ritual and social power. Leaders were not yet kings, but they were guardians of cosmic order, responsible for maintaining balance through ritual precision. Beyond the burials, other features of Nabta Playa point to its dual nature as both practical and ceremonial. Stone alignments marked solstices and star risings, but the placement of certain megaliths suggests symbolic arrangements as well. Some of the largest stones, weighing several tons, were positioned not for astronomical precision but as markers of ritual space. Their orientation may have created ceremonial boundaries, designating zones where the community gathered for feasting, sacrifice, and observance. Excavated hearths and scattered remains of livestock confirm that gatherings took place, binding the group in shared ritual practice at specific times of year. The interplay of practical and sacred cannot be separated. The alignments that marked the summer solstice were not abstract. They coincided with the arrival of rains that refilled the lake. Ritual ensured that the community returned at the right time, converging on the playa to water cattle, conduct ceremonies, and reaffirm their social bonds. The sacrifices ensured the continuity of rainfall, while the calendar stones guaranteed accuracy of timing. This fusion of function and meaning transformed Nabta Playa into both a survival tool and a ceremonial center, a place where cosmology and subsistence met. The cattle burials at Nabta Playa carry echoes of traditions that later emerged in the Nile Valley. In Pharaonic Egypt, cattle held immense symbolic value, embodied in the Apis bull, worshipped as a living manifestation of divine power. The burial of sacred bulls in massive sarcophagi at Sahara millennia later recalls, in its grandeur, the same impulse that drove pastoralists of the Sahara to inter their animals beneath stone mounds. The continuity suggests that the ritual significance of cattle at Nabta Playa did not vanish but filtered into the religious structures of early Egypt, carrying with it the memory of sacrifice and the sanctity of livestock. The tumuli also reveal how communities used sacred landscapes to assert identity. By returning to the same place to bury animals, by raising stone markers and creating alignments, pastoral groups transformed the playa into a monument of memory. Each burial tied the living to the ancestors who had sacrificed before them, reinforcing lineage and belonging. These acts bound dispersed groups together, ensuring that even in migration they shared a common ceremonial center. The playa was not only a watering hole but a place of renewal for social order, where disputes were settled, alliances reaffirmed, and obligations fulfilled under the watch of stone and sky. The effort involved in transporting megaliths into the basin speaks further to ritual power. Some of the stones were dragged from outcrops several kilometers away, requiring coordinated labor far beyond what was necessary for simple survival. Their placement in symbolic arrangements shows that their purpose exceeded utility. Such undertakings demanded collective participation, uniting the group under a shared cosmological vision. The leaders who directed these efforts held authority not only over practical survival but over the distribution of spiritual responsibility. The rise of ritual hierarchy at Nabta Playa provides a glimpse into the early stages of social complexity. While not yet urbanized or stratified in the manner of later civilizations, the community's willingness to sacrifice resources, organize large-scale labor, and maintain ceremonial traditions reflects a shift from egalitarian structures toward more formalized leadership. The sacred landscape was both a mirror of belief and a tool of authority, binding people through obligation and reverence. When archaeologists excavated these features in the late 20th century, the scale of the ritual landscape became clear. The tumuli, numbering in the dozens, stretched across the playa, interwoven with stone alignments and ceremonial hearths. Taken together, they form one of the earliest known ritual complexes in Africa, a site where cosmology, survival, and hierarchy converged. The pastoralists of Nabta Playa did not merely react to their environment. They restructured it, carving meaning into the desert through sacrifice and stone. The sacred landscape thus stands as evidence that ritual power shaped society long before kingship, temples, or writing. In the Sahara, around 600 to 4500 BCE, cattle burials, tumuli, and symbolic stone placements transformed a seasonal lake into a ceremonial center. The people who gathered here tied their survival to cosmic cycles and bound their communities through sacrifice. Each stone raised, each burial sealed, each feast consumed under the stars was part of a system that combined the practical need for timing and water with the sacred need for order and continuity. Nabta Playa's sacred landscape was not merely built of stone. It was built of obligation, authority, and the enduring bond between human society, the heavens, and the animals that sustained life. The question of Nabta Playa's legacy stands like the stones themselves, silent, immovable, yet loaded with meaning. Scholars who have studied the site since the 1970s have found themselves drawn into a debate as vast as the Sahara. Did the traditions of this desert community flow northward to shape the religious imagination of ancient Egypt, or did similar ideas simply emerge independently under parallel conditions? It is a question without a final answer, but the evidence binds Nabta Playa and the Nile Valley in ways that cannot be ignored. Between 6000 and 4000 BCE, the Sahara was not the lifeless expanse it later became. Seasonal rains created habitable basins, and pastoral groups moved with their cattle across these lands. Nabta Playa, with its megaliths aligned to solstices and its tumuli containing sacrificed cattle, reveals a society already steeped in ritual and astronomy. At the same time, further north along the Nile, small farming communities were beginning to cluster near the riverbanks, planting wheat and barley and tending animals in a landscape defined by predictable floods. By 3500 BCE, these Nile communities were forming into proto-kingdoms, and within a few centuries Egypt itself would emerge as the world's first great territorial state. The parallels strike hard. At Nabta Playa, cattle were not simply food. They were sacred beings whose burial sanctified the relationship between humans and the divine. In early dynastic Egypt, stretching from the unification around 3100 BCE to the Old Kingdom of the Third Millennium, cattle again held central symbolic weight. The Apis bull in Memphis became a living manifestation of the god Ptah, a creature ritually selected, revered during its life, and buried with monumental ceremony in massive sarcophagi. The echoes between these traditions are difficult to dismiss. A pastoral culture in the Sahara burying whole cattle 6,000 years before Christ, and the Egyptians later elevating cattle into divine symbols at the heart of their theology. Astronomy deepens the connection. Nabta Playa's megalithic circle, dated to roughly 4800 to 4500 BCE, is aligned to mark the summer solstice and possibly the rising of key stars such as Sirius and Orion's belt. Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, later became the cornerstone of the Egyptian calendar, its heliacal rising announcing the annual inundation of the Nile. The connection between celestial order and earthly survival was thus written into the Egyptian worldview. Orion, associated with Osiris in Egyptian mythology, was central to funerary belief, guiding the souls of kings into eternity. The question presses forward. Did the pastoralists of Nabta Playa carry this celestial knowledge northward as they migrated when the desert dried, embedding their star lore into the religious systems of the Nile Valley? Or did the Egyptians, facing similar ecological rhythms, develop their own cosmic interpretations independently? The alignments of Egyptian temples add weight to the debate. Many temples were oriented towards solstice sunrises, lunar cycles, or star risings, a continuation of the principle seen at Nabta Playa where stone markers fix the relationship between human ceremony and the cosmos. The Temple of Amoni-Asri at Karnak, whose main axis points to the winter solstice sunrise, echoes the same precision in astronomical orientation. While the scale of Karnak dwarfs the megaliths of the Sahara, the underlying idea is the same. Sacred architecture bound to celestial cycles, human ritual synchronized with the heavens. Cultural transmission, however, is not easily proven. Archaeologists caution that parallels do not always mean lineage. The burial of cattle could emerge in multiple societies that viewed livestock as both sustenance and spiritual anchors. Astronomical alignment of monuments could develop in any community attentive to the cycles of stars and seasons. The Nile Valley, with its dependable floods and clear skies, provided conditions that may have independently fostered sophisticated astronomical and religious systems. Independent development remains a strong academic position. Yet the timing of environmental change complicates the matter. By 5000 to 3000 BCE, the Sahara was undergoing desiccation, its once green basins shrinking into arid expanses. The pastoral groups of Nabta Playa could not remain. They were forced to migrate in search of reliable water. Archaeological evidence suggests population movement toward the Nile Valley during this period. If these groups carried with them traditions of cattle ritual and celestial alignment, their influence may have blended with emerging Nile societies, seeding ideas that would grow into Egypt's vast religious system. The cultural memory of cattle sacrifice and star observation could have been preserved, adapted, and expanded in a new environment where monumental architecture and centralized authority could magnify it beyond anything possible in a desert camp. The debate intensifies when one considers the role of the sun. At Nabta Playa, solstice alignments were functional, ensuring the community gathered when rains were due. In Egypt, the sun was elevated into divinity itself. By the Old Kingdom, Ra, the sun god, stood at the pinnacle of the pantheon, embodied in the daily cycle of rising and setting. Pharaohs aligned their pyramids and mortuary temples with solar and stellar events, ensuring their eternal union with cosmic order. Scholars argue whether the seeds of solar worship were planted in the Saharan rituals or whether they arose independently from the Nile's rhythms. The connection remains suggestive but unproven, a thread of possibility woven into the archaeological record. Speculation runs further in theories linking Orion and Osiris to Nabta Playa. The megalithic alignments that may correspond to Orion's belt resemble later Egyptian myths that identified Osiris with those same stars. The alignment of pyramids on the Giza Plateau, some argue, reflects this same constellation. Critics, however, warn against overextending the data. The alignments at Nabta Playa are not universally accepted as intentional star maps. Some may be coincidental. The temptation to connect dots across millennia must be checked against the rigor of archaeological evidence. Still, the cultural parallels extend beyond ritual and astronomy. The concept of sacred landscapes, the deliberate construction of space as a fusion of natural environment and ritual practice, appears in both Nabta Playa and Egypt. At Nabta, cattle burials, megalithic circles, and tumuli transformed a seasonal lake into a ceremonial hub. In Egypt, temple complexes, pyramids, and processional ways reshaped the landscape into a cosmic map. Both societies bound space, ritual, and cosmology into integrated systems, suggesting continuity in worldview if not direct descent. The cautious academic position insists on restraint. Nabta Playa represents an early pastoral society with ritual complexity, while Egypt emerged from a unique synthesis of Nile ecology, agricultural surpluses, and political centralization. Yet the speculative position continues to press its case. The timing of migrations, the shared emphasis on cattle, the use of solstice alignments, the astronomical focus on Sirius and Orion. All of these threads weave into a tapestry that hints at legacy. In the end, Nabta Playa remains a site of questions more than answers. What can be said with certainty is that in the millennia before Egypt rose, pastoralists in the Sahara were already aligning stones to stars, burying cattle with reverence, and constructing landscapes of ritual power. Whether their traditions flowed into the Nile Valley or whether Egypt's grandeur arose independently, the resonance between the two cannot be silenced. The stones at Nabta stand as witnesses to a dialogue across time, a dialogue still unfinished, carrying with it the weight of history's greatest mysteries. Around 5000 BCE, the basin of Nabta Playa still held seasonal water. The rains of the African humid period, fed by a monsoon system that reached far into the Sahara, sustained life in what is now one of the driest regions on Earth. Pastoral groups gathered here, their cattle grazing along the lake's edge, their rituals transforming the place into more than a watering hole. Megalithic alignments fixed their relationship to the stars, while tumuli of sacrificed cattle consecrated the bond between survival and the sacred. For nearly 2,000 years, the basin served as both refuge and shrine. Yet by 400 BCE, the cycle shifted. The monsoons weakened, the rains retreated, and the lake at the heart of Nabta began to vanish. The climate change was relentless, and its effects were irreversible. The once green Sahara that had supported pastoral herders turned toward desiccation, a transformation visible in the archaeological record. Layers of lake sediments show decreasing water levels, and faunal remains shrink in diversity. By the 4th millennium BCE, the seasonal waters that had drawn people for generations no longer returned. The basin, once a hub of ritual life, fell silent. The herders could not remain where the pastures had disappeared. Nabta Playa's monuments, its stone circles aligned to solstices, its megaliths pointing toward the stars, stood abandoned in the sand. The cultural memory of what had been created there, however, did not vanish with the lake. The drying of the Sahara coincided with a decisive human migration. Groups who had once moved seasonally across the desert turned eastward toward the Nile Valley. The river provided what the desert had taken away: permanent water, fertile soil, and a predictable rhythm of life. Archaeologists trace these movements through ceramic styles, burial customs, and subsistence practices, finding echoes of Saharan traditions embedded in Nile Valley cultures. The pastoralists of Nabta, carrying cattle-based rituals and memories of astronomical shrines, merged into the growing riverine settlements. These migrations coincided with the formative centuries leading to Egypt's consolidation as a state, suggesting that the legacy of Nabta may have flowed directly into the Nile's emerging civilization. The cultural cargo carried from Nabta was heavy with meaning. The ritual killing and burial of cattle, a practice central to the desert shrine, has been interpreted as a prototype of Egypt's later bull cults. The astronomical alignments of Nabta's stones resonate with the orientation of temples and pyramids in dynastic Egypt. Even the symbolic weight of water, seasonal in the desert, annual along the Nile, may have carried spiritual continuity. Where Nabta's herders once gathered at solstice to await the rains, Egyptians later awaited the heliacal rising of Sirius to signal the flood. The shift from desert basin to river valley did not erase the old worldview. It transplanted it into a landscape where it could grow on a monumental scale. The abandonment of Nabta Playa marked not only ecological collapse but also transformation. The drying of the Sahara created one of the great turning points in African prehistory. The pastoralists who built the stone circle and cattle tumuli did not disappear. They became part of a new cultural synthesis along the Nile. Archaeological continuity shows that Nile Valley groups of the 4th millennium BCE inherited pastoral traditions, blending them with agriculture and riverine lifeways. The stone shrines of Nabta stood behind them as silent ancestors, evidence that long before pyramids and temples, human beings in Africa were already binding ritual to cosmos, already shaping sacred landscapes to match celestial patterns. The memory of Nabta may have lived not in stories preserved but in practices transmitted. The idea that cattle could embody the divine, that stones could anchor human life to the stars, that ritual architecture could fix a community's place in the universe. All of these concepts appear later in Egypt, magnified but never divorced from their simpler origins. Even if the direct line of influence remains debated, the resonance is undeniable. The people who left the desert carried with them more than herds and tools. They carried an intellectual inheritance forged in the struggle against an unforgiving environment. The shrinking lake of Nabta thus represents more than ecological decline. It represents the adaptation of human beings to radical climate change, the transfer of knowledge from one landscape to another, the persistence of ritual ideas across migrations. The stones remain where they were raised 6,000 years ago, but the people who placed them moved on, carrying their meanings into new worlds. The basin filled with silence, but its legacy echoed along the Nile, where temples would rise in alignment with the sun, and cattle would be consecrated as divine beings. Nabta Playa today lies exposed beneath the desert sky, stripped of the waters that once gave it life. Yet even in its abandonment it speaks, not of loss alone, but of survival. The vanishing lake forced its people to move, but in moving they ensured that their traditions did not perish. What had been a seasonal sanctuary in the desert became, through migration, a foundation for one of history's greatest civilizations. The stones that mark solstices and stars stand as proof that the first astronomers of Africa worked here, binding their lives to the cosmos long before Egypt rose. Their monument endures, a prehistoric testimony that refuses to be silenced, still pressing its questions into the present.